Good evening and happy Thursday, everyone. Welcome to the Foundation for Free Enterprise Education's live speaker series. Changing times means changing how we do things. Every summer, our foundation brings over 2,100 students to Pennsylvania Free Enterprise Week. Volunteers and business professionals from all areas of the state, and even the country, come together to educate and encourage young people to learn about our American free enterprise system and their important role in it. Over the coming weeks, you're going to get a sneak peek at one of the very special and important pieces of the PFEW experience, our motivational speakers. Their passion for educating our young people and helping them through life's challenges is truly one of the greatest parts of our programming. We are honored to call them our friends, and we are so thankful they have agreed to share some of their stories with you in this series. You may recognize many of our guests as they may have visited your school or in an event you attended, or maybe you have seen them online. Motivating and inspiring youth is not only their job, it's their passion. If their messages bring some meaning to you, we hope you will reach out to them or to us, or perhaps look into inviting them to your school or to your event. All of their contact information is available on our website, and we will provide it at the end of the night. As you listen to their messages, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them with us in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring those and get to as many of them as possible after their remarks. Also, for those of you who are interested in some additional interaction with tonight's speakers, stay with us, and a link to a live virtual meet and greet breakout session will be provided at the conclusion of the event. Just as a reminder, or in case you aren't aware, our Thursday night live sessions are only half of our offerings. Be sure to check out our website for our pre-taped interviews that will provide advice, information, and career exploration tools from a variety of different industries. Over the next few months, we will have over 50 different interviews, along with workbooks and tools for teachers and students to utilize. We are excited to bring all of these messages to you and hope they will create mentorships or connections that are meaningful. So thank you for joining us. We look forward to gathering every Thursday evening through the summer for this fantastic live series. If we have learned nothing else from the past few months, it's that life has changed for all of us. Now it's time to adapt. Kicking off our speaker series tonight, please welcome Sweethearts and Heroes.
This man is a mixed martial artist standing in the red corner. For the winner by TKO, Tom Murphy.
From St. Albans, Vermont, USA, this is...
Good evening, students and anyone else listening from Pennsylvania as well as across the country. Pennsylvania is my home state, born and raised in the city of Philadelphia. I said that one time at PFEW and said I was from Philadelphia, and they said, well, you're not from Pennsylvania. But It is always my responsibility that whenever I show young people what I have done in my free time, it's always my responsibility to educate young people and people in general about the sport of mixed martial arts. And when I go to schools or do events with young people or educators or even parents, I always say I'm going to tell you one thing about mixed martial arts, and I'm not going to mention it for the rest of the time that we're together. Just one thing. I hate fighting. There's nothing that I find more despicable. There's nothing that I find more hurtful. That when I see a young man or a young woman get into a fight to try and solve their problems. Now, it's always my responsibility that whenever I do show young men and young women what I like to do in my free time, it's also my responsibility to educate them. And no better place to educate young people than at a fine camp like PFEW or in our educational institutions. So if I were to go and find a dictionary here on my shelf or in a school or even in your home, and I ripped it open to the word fighting, here's what you'd see. It's a verb to use violent physical means such as blows, fists, or weapons to overpower someone. Now, some of you watching might say, aha, that's exactly what you were doing. You were using your fist to overpower someone. But the key in the definition, students, educators, parents, is the word violence. I've never gone into a ring and thought, man, I can't wait to kill that guy. I can't wait to murder him. I've always gone into the ring in the spirit of competition, the process of trying to win or do better than others. For me, that sport's no different than a game of basketball, baseball, maybe even a solid game of chess. I have spent 20 years of my life preparing to get into a ring, and I only compete against other men that have spent that long, sometimes longer, in the sport of mixed martial arts. We have referees, we have judges, we have medical personnel to take care of the safety of the competitors. Don't confuse violence and aggression. It's a very aggressive sport. And I never ask people to agree with me. It's just my responsibility to tell young people that I hate fighting, I never solve my problems that way, and I never will. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here to talk about something extremely serious. We go around the country and we talk to young people about a lot of different issues. One of the big horses that we ride in on is this horse called bullying. And it's something that I may mention once or twice tonight, but this conversation is going to be a little bit different. It's certainly going to revolve around what's happened recently in our country, as well as over the last several months. I think the best way to always start this discussion with a group of people, especially that I can't see, which is a little bit awkward, anybody, I usually just start this discussion by saying, what do you do when you catch on fire? Now, if I say that in an auditorium of young people, doesn't matter how old, in almost unison, in less than a second, they can give us that little jingle that we all heard growing up. Stop, drop, and roll. And I ask any of you listening right now, how many people have you ever met in your entire life that have ever used that? That stop, drop, and roll. And for most of you out there, you might scratch your head and think, geez, I'm not sure. I don't think I've ever met anyone that's actually used that thing that we all learned across this country when we were just little kids. How many students between the ages of 10 and 19 actually die in fires every single year in this country? The answer, about 135. About 135 actually perish, unfortunately, in fires between the ages of 10 and 19 in this country every single year. So we've taught 50 million students what to do when they never catch on fire. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not making light of fire safety. It's extremely important to teach young people skills like that, especially at those age levels. But let me ask you another question. How many students between the ages of 10 and 19 attempt to end their own lives every single year in this country? Between 500,000 and 1 million students try and take themselves out of this world every single year in this country. This is perhaps the greatest moral puzzle that we have ever faced in human history. And the answer, the solution that we will bring to you tonight truly does change the world. when I talk to people and I say, why? What's led so many kids to this destructive decision? And certainly suicide is not the number one destructive decision or the only destructive decision we're talking about here today. There's lots of destructive decisions that kids make. We know that suicide hotline calls are up anywhere from 400% over the last month to 8,000% in some of the cities around this country. And it's something that we focus on very dearly because we're talking about young people, our future. And we should be asking why. Why are so many young people thinking about, attempting this destructive decision? We should be asking why. And when I ever talk to parents or adults or even educators, I always say to them, if you want the answer, if you took the time to watch that show that most of the kids on this call, if they're in middle school or high school, watched a couple of years ago, you'd figure it out. It's one word. You can summarize this show into one word. And it doesn't really matter to me if you agree with this show or not. I might not even agree with it, but I watched it because I know most of the young people I were going to talk to watched it, and I wanted to have common language with them. And I can summarize this show into one word. It's the same reason why 22 service members take their own lives every single day in this country. It's the same word. It's the same reason that Olivia Scott, Amanda Todd, Brian Halligan, Tina Meyer's daughter, it's the same word. They felt hopeless. They felt like they couldn't hold on. They felt like there were no possibilities that existed for their future, so they gave up. Understand this if you're listening. Since 2007, suicides in 10 to 14-year-olds have doubled. In high school students, it's up over 70%. There is no greater moral puzzle that we have the responsibility to solve than this one. And you say, what leads a kid? What leads a young person to this feeling of hopelessness? How come we have a generation of young people that feel more hopeless than ever before in human history? We should ask these questions. We should look deeply into these questions when we think about, when we know young people that are in our lives or in this country that we call home. What leads a person to this feeling of hopelessness? And there's these common threads that we all share. It's like what it means to be human. You probably may never have thought about some of the things that it means to be human, the common threads that we all share. Everyone on this call, all of the citizens of this country, this common thread weaves between all of us. See, we all have obviously a need for food, shelter, and water. But what about after that? What does it truly mean to be human? What are the common threads that join us together as humans? We know that one of the things that leads a young person, a service member, to this feeling of hopelessness is this lack of meaning or significance or purpose in their life. We know the great philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He said, he who has a why to live can bear anyhow. We have a generation of young people that feel like they have very little meaning. And especially over the last 3 months when we ripped that meaning from them in the education that they were getting. Meaninglessness, significance, purpose. But what's the other thing that we all share? What's one of these other common threads besides just meaning or purpose that young people struggle with? It's human acceptance. You know, if you isolate a human for 3 days, they say there's measurable amounts of brain damage. See, when I talk to young people, I understand that they're just a bunch of pack animals. For most of them, their friends and their peers are some of the most important people in their lives right now. And for many students that are listening right now, some of you, your friends are the most important thing in your lives. It's funny that I talk to kids almost every day online, young people. I connect with classes around the country. And when we first announced this shutdown and schools were going to close, there were so many young people that were like, yes, school's all done. And then a month later, I talked to so many of them, and the loss of friendship and companionship and human acceptance that they so deeply craved was taken from them as well. And when you combine these two things, this loss of significance or meaning or this struggle that young people have with that, and the deep need they have to be accepted by others, The cocktail, what's created this giant cauldron of hopelessness, is what truly leads a young person to make some of these destructive decisions, and for many of them, the ultimate destructive decision that takes them from this world. But there is light. There is this thing called hope. And there is this other common thread, and this is what we bring to young people, this notion, this other common thread that we all share. It weaves between all of us. It's this notion of these creatures called sweethearts and heroes. And some people say to me all the time, they say, what do you mean by sweethearts and heroes? What are these creatures that you talk about? In order to start this discussion, I have to take you on a journey, a bit of a journey. I have to take you back into the 16th century. When was that? About 40 years after Columbus sailed. In the beginning of the 1500s was the 16th century. And there was a word that was born. And this is one of the main reasons that we go across the country and talk to young people. There's this word that was born in the beginning of the 16th century, and the word was the word bully. You know, that blustering, quarrelsome, overbearing person who habitually, intentionally badgers smaller, weaker people? That one. For many of you listening that are adults, you can immediately flash back to that person that was in your school, in your community, that was quarrelsome and blustering and overbearing and habitually, intentionally badgering weaker people, that person. But when the word bully was first invented, when it was first coined, it didn't mean that at all. Now, most of you listening won't believe this, but when the word bully was first invented, it actually meant sweetheart. It was a very endearing term. In the 16th century, if you were going to go to the school dance, you would take your bully with you. And most people shake their head and they say, no, that can't be it. But the word bully in the 16th century was a very endearing term. And this is one of those common threads that we all share. There's not a person on this call right now. Every single one of you are on here because of your 16th century bullies, your sweethearts. You know, that person that when you didn't feel like going to practice, they said, get your stuff and get in the car. When you didn't feel like opening up that case and pulling that instrument out and practicing, they made you. They made you open that textbook when you really just didn't feel like it. Maybe one time when you were in college and you didn't feel like getting out of bed because things weren't going too well, they called you up and said, get your clothes on, I'm coming over. Those are these 16th century bullies. They give us this thing called hope. And this is one of the things that we've really identified that changes and possibly and does save lives, this notion of hope. And you say, well, what does hope stand for? Hope stands for hold on, possibilities exist. H-O-P-E. We have a generation of young people that don't feel like they can hold on, like they don't feel like possibilities exist for their future. And this isn't the first time in this country. There's been many times in this country when our citizens, when our young people have felt hopeless. And I know when this whole pandemic happened and when the quarantine happened, hopelessness just spiked. And so many of our young people are struggling even more with this hopelessness. And then just over the last week or two, the things that have happened in this country have just compounded hopelessness. But there is hope. And I wanted to quickly take you back to another time in this country when hopelessness was at an all-time high for some of the young people, for some of the families in this country. And I got to thinking about this just shortly after they announced the shutdown of the schools and the schools we were going to have to cancel and not be in. 50 schools we had to call and say, we're not going to be there because the doors are closing. And certainly that led a lot of people that were expecting us to be there to feel like, uh-oh, what's this going to do to our young people? But this isn't the first time that this has happened across this country. I wanted to quickly zoom you back to the year 1915. And you say, well, what was America like? And what could that have to do with this quarantine and some of the difficulties that our young people and our citizens are facing? 1915, Woodrow Wilson was the president. And if you think about what life was like back then, the average middle-class family made about $600 a year, which equates to about $60,000 today. There certainly were cars on the road, in 1915. There were about 2 million cars on the road a year in 1915. And some of you watching might think, wow, that's a lot of cars. But as compared to today, where there's about 300 million cars on the road, I'm just trying to give you a little perspective. It's something that we love talking a lot about, this thing called perspective. And if you're a middle school student, or even if you're going into or in high school, most kids in 1915 left school at about 14 years of age. So if you're in middle school, this was probably your last year of school. And about half of American families, and this is what I wanted to center on, lived on farms. But just about everybody in America was dependent on the land for their livelihood. Even if you weren't a farming family, one of those half of Americans that lived and worked on a farm, probably just about everything else in a community depended on the land. If your family had a store, you certainly had to get the vegetables and the wood and a lot of the natural resources that came from the land to sell in your store. If your family made clothing, you still had to get that cotton and other things from the land. So just about everyone in America was dependent on the land. Let me zoom you real quickly to the city of Enterprise, Alabama. Let me zoom you, 1915, Enterprise, Alabama. One of the leading producers, if not the leading producer of cotton in the United States at the time. 1915, half of American families lived on farms, and just about everyone, and I'm sure you can imagine a rural community like Enterprise, everyone was dependent on that cotton crop just for life. Enter the boll weevil. It's an agricultural pest. It's from Central America. And for some reason, in 1915, this little critter and millions of its buddies decide to cross the border and infest the southern United States. And as I sat on my couch and I thought about the shutdown and this virus, this story just kind of popped into my head. And I thought, man, this virus is just like this boll weevil in 1915. I had lots of people in some of the businesses that I'm part of call me upset. I had several that called me in tears and said, what am I going to do? How am I going to feed my family? And the story just came into my mind. And I thought, well, what did the people of Enterprise, Alabama do? Because this little critter and all of its buddies, as it infested the southern United States, wipes out the cotton crop. Now, this was 1915, like I said. There weren't stimulus checks, and the Red Cross didn't zoom into their community and fix everything and distribute all kinds of products and things for people. They were in big trouble. So what did they do? They got together as a community. We know that when humans get together and they share with and they play with ideas and they form this community and they work together, the emotional intelligence of the entire group can go up. And that's what these people did in 1915 Enterprise. They got together as a community. They said, what are we going to do in the midst of this calamity? And one guy said, geez, I noticed that I have this little patch of peanuts that I have for my kids. It's just a little patch of peanuts. My kids like peanuts. And the boll weevils didn't eat a single leaf on this plant. Another guy scratched his head and said, you know what? I noticed the same thing. They didn't touch a single one of my plants. And then another guy jumped up and another guy jumped up and they said, we're onto something here. And one guy got so excited, he said, you know what? I'm going to start planting peanut plants everywhere. And then someone said, well, that's a really dumb idea. Like, we're never going to have time for these plants to be planted and to grow and to harvest them. And who the heck wants all this peanut butter anyway? They had consensus and they shared and they came up with, as a team, as a community, that they were going to change their agriculture and they were going to grow peanuts. And by 1919, Enterprise, Alabama became the largest producers of peanuts in the world. If you go to Enterprise today at the corner of Main and College Street, you'll see this enormous monument. You can see the size of it compared to this car. And they put this boll weevil on the top, and there's a sign at the base of this that says, in profound appreciation. Now think about that. In like spectacular, amazing appreciation of the boll weevil and what it has done as the herald of prosperity. They basically called this bug, this agricultural pest that nearly wiped them off the face of the earth. They call this thing a hero for what it has done as the herald of prosperity. Now, anybody listening, you know as well as I do that in 1915, when everyone got together and tears were being shed and people were scared and frustrated, just like happened to us just 3 months ago, that's exactly what happened. I got the calls. So many of you had parents that got calls and were scared and lost their jobs, and no one knew what was going to happen. But by 1919, Enterprise, Alabama became the largest producer of peanuts in the world. And I make the claim that without people giving each other hope, providing that hope for each other, holding on to the possibilities that exist, coming together as a community, sharing, playing with ideas, the emotional intelligence of everyone in that community growing, sharing this thing called hope, being these 16th century bullies, pushing each other. You know, there were so many times when somebody had to go help someone else and pull someone out of bed and just help them, bully them the right way to help make them better. They gave each other this thing called hope. I wouldn't be who I am today, students, educators, parents, citizens listening. I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for my 16th century bullies. If it wasn't for someone that taught me about this thing called hope and how it changes and saves lives, I wouldn't be on this call today if it wasn't for one of my 16th century bullies. And it gives me no greater pride than to introduce one of my 16th century bullies, one of my sweethearts. And I always find the best way to introduce him is like this.
I heard the boom, and as soon as I heard the boom, I was on fire. There's no time to react other than get out. The hatch above me was open, thank God, because if it wasn't, I would have never found the lever to get out.
Keep your head up, keep your back straight. Good to go.
Again, it gives me no greater honor than to introduce one of the world's hope experts, Mr. Rick Yarosh.
So that was the best thing that ever happened to me. Now, that is hard for many people to understand, especially you, for hearing that the first time, seeing that video for the first time, seeing me for the first time, and then hearing those words for the first time. I understand that that sounds impossible, but that's the best thing that ever happened to me. So good evening, everyone. I am so excited to be with you all tonight. I'm excited to tell you my story. I'm excited to tell you about hope. I'm excited to tell you about some of the sweethearts in my life who have changed my life forever. And you know what? I've had some sweethearts in my life even save my life. And I'm excited to tell you the stories that I have about those sweethearts. I get to talk to you about hope, what hope stands for, Tom told you, and what it means to me. Because hold on, possibilities exist. There's not many things bigger than that in this world. We all need hope to keep on going. So I'm going to bring you back to a day where hope and hopelessness in my life became bigger than anything else. And that was September 1st, 2006, when I was in Iraq on a patrol on a dirt road that I had been on many times before in a vehicle called a Bradley. Now, for many of you, you have no idea what a Bradley is. Well, here you go. This is a Bradley. A Bradley is basically a small tank. It's a vehicle that many people would consider a small tank. It has tracks on the bottom, and they call it, it's called a Bradley. So I was on a patrol on a road that I had been on many times before. The only thing different with this day was that somebody had buried an IED underneath the road. IED stands for Improvised Explosive Device. It's basically a homemade bomb. Well, my Bradley ran over that bomb, and the bomb detonated. It exploded, went through the bottom of my vehicle up into the turret where I was sitting. But also in the turret is where we have our fuel tank. And it hit the fuel tank, covering myself, my two buddies who were in the vehicle with me, and the vehicle in fuel, and instantly we were on fire. Now that picture is an actual picture of my Bradley after it had burned for many, many hours. Now you can see from that picture before, now where that guy is standing on top of the Bradley, that's the turret. That's the part of the vehicle that I was in. And you can see in the next picture, that turret is no longer there. It had basically melted into the vehicle. So as soon as the Bradley was on fire, like I said, I was on fire. And I knew the first thing that I had to do was I had to escape. I had to get out. If I had any chance to survive, I had to get out of that vehicle. Now, every day when I climbed into that Bradley, I would climb up to the very top of the turret, and then I would climb down in. That's where the hatch was, so I would climb down in through the hatch. And every day that I did that, I would close the hatch cover behind me. Now, I closed the hatch cover behind me because I was supposed to keep it closed. Every single day I climbed in, I would close it. And we were supposed to keep it closed because if we ever got hit with chemicals. Now, if our vehicle got hit with chemicals and all the hatches were closed, none of the chemicals could get into the vehicle. So we would close them every time. That day that I climbed in, I didn't close the hatch cover behind me. Thank God. Now, I say thank God because if I had closed that hatch cover, I don't think I ever would have gotten out of that vehicle. With the chaos of everything that was going on, with that smoke and that fire, I don't think I ever would have found that little lever above my head that I would have had to hit. And then I don't know if I would have had the strength to push open that heavy hatch cover. But thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that because I left it open that day. So I climbed through. I got to the top. I got out. Now, I had to do something else. I had to get away from the vehicle. But there was two big problems with that, getting off of the vehicle. The first problem was the fact that it's a long ways down. Now, from the top of the turret to the ground is 10 feet. Now, 10 feet is easy to imagine because a basketball rim. The rim on a basketball hoop is 10 feet off of the ground. So if you can imagine yourself standing on a basketball rim and looking down, that would be a long ways. I mean, if you're 5 feet tall and you're looking down, basically from your eyes to the ground, that's 15 feet. It's a long ways. That was a big problem. That wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was the fact that I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see anything because my face was on fire and the fire was actually covering my eyes. But I knew I had to get away from that vehicle. I knew I had to get off of that vehicle. So I knew I was just going to have to jump. I was going to have to take a leap of faith and hope that I would make it off of the vehicle and hope I would make it to the ground safely. So I did jump. I did take that leap of faith. I did make it off of the vehicle. I did make it to the ground, but I did not make it to the ground safely, because when I landed, I couldn't brace myself for the impact of the landing because I couldn't see the ground. So when I hit, it came unexpectedly. And when I hit, I broke my leg and I severed an artery in my leg, which led to an amputation 4 or 5 days later when I was in the hospital. Now, when I was laying on that ground, I was still on fire. I had bigger things to deal with than just my leg being broken. I was still on fire. And I knew I had to put that fire out. So what were we all taught to do? Stop, drop, and roll. I mean, we learned that when we were probably 3, 4, 5 years old. That's what we do when we're on fire. So that's what I did. I rolled around on the ground, and all I did was set the grass on fire and roll around in the dust. I could not put the fire out. I couldn't put the fire out because I had too much fuel on me. And that's when I did something that I regret. That's when I laid on my back and I stared up into the sky and I gave up. I gave up that all-important thing, that thing I mentioned in the beginning, the thing that Tom talked about earlier. I gave up hope. H-O-P-E, hold on, possibilities exist. In that moment of hopelessness for me, I was giving up on all the possibilities that existed for my future. Now, I had no idea what those possibilities were, but it didn't matter what they were because I was giving up on every single one of them. We have to hold on to find out the possibilities that exist in our future. Now, I'm talking life or death right now in the situation that I was dealing with that day. But that's not all I'm talking about. I'm talking about difficult things that we all deal with in life, like what we're going through now. This isn't easy. This isn't easy for anyone because it's new to everyone. This is something we are not used to. We've never experienced anything like this before. So we're trying to figure it out. It's difficult. And in difficult times, people can become hopeless. I'm talking about stuff that you deal with in your home. I'm talking about stuff you deal with at work. I'm just talking about difficult things. But if you give up on those difficult things, you'll never find out the potential that you have through those difficult things. I can tell you right now, some of the worst things, some of the most difficult things that we deal with in life are worth the most when we get through them. And I only know that because of what I went through, because of my injury and because of my recovery. I went through something very difficult, but it led to something so amazing. One of those amazing things is just the opportunity I have today to sit in front of this screen. Even though I can't sit in front of you all face to face, I get this opportunity today. This is still an opportunity. It's not what we wanted, but sometimes we don't get what we want. We fight through it and we'll get the opportunity again. Hopefully I can join PFBW next year, face to face. But this is some of the best things that ever happened to me. Now, I told you that day was the best thing, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I'll tell you that it was the best day of my life. It took me a long time to recognize that. But if I hadn't held on, I wouldn't have found out those possibilities that existed. So we have to hold on to find out the possibilities that exist for our future. Now, thankfully for me, that day in Iraq, I only gave up hope for a second. Now, unfortunately, sometimes a second is all it takes, truly. But for me, it wasn't. I ended up rolling in one direction. I had no idea which direction I was rolling in. I could have been rolling right back to that burning Bradley. Thankfully, I wasn't. I was rolling away from it, and I actually rolled into a canal that was there. A canal that I had no idea was there. And it had just enough water in it to extinguish the flames. Now, eventually, a couple of my buddies, they found me in the canal. One of them came down and he grabbed my legs. Another one came down and he grabbed underneath my arms. And then they both carried me up to the top of the canal where the helicopters would eventually pick us up. But when I got to the top of the canal, that's when everything started to sink in. Like how bad things really were. I knew how bad they were because I could see how bad my hands were burnt because my palms, they were hanging from my fingertips. I knew how bad my face was burnt, and I didn't need anyone to tell me, and I didn't need a mirror to see it. I knew how bad my face was burnt because it was hanging from my chin. I knew that in that moment, if I lived, which I'm telling you right now, I didn't know if I would live or not. I knew my injuries were bad enough I might not live. But if I did live, my life was going to be different. Every single thing I knew up to that point was about to change. Now, one of my buddies who had pulled me out of that canal, he was standing over me and he was helping me deal with this very difficult situation that I was dealing with. And I asked him a really dumb question. I said, how bad is it? Like, I knew how bad it was. I saw my hands and I saw my face. I knew how bad it was. But as a good friend would do in that kind of situation, he lied to me. And he said, it's not that bad. And I looked back at him and I said, well, I will never be as ugly as you are. So a little humor in that situation. You know, all my buddies in my platoon, they all knew that I had a sense of humor. And I think that seeing that my sense of humor was still there, even though I was going through something pretty difficult, pretty awful, what most people would consider, even though, and I still had that sense of humor, maybe it gave them a little hope. The hope that, hey, maybe Rick's going to make it through this after all. Now, eventually the helicopters did get there. They came, they took myself and my two buddies who were in the vehicle with me that day away to the hospital. Unfortunately, that helicopter ride, that was the last time that I ever saw my good friend, Sergeant Luis Montes, ever again. Sergeant Montes passed away 7 days later from the injuries that he received that day that we were injured together. So obviously in that story, there's some hopelessness. But there was also some hope. The hope that I got back that day that I was on that ground and on fire. Now that day, there was nobody else standing over me physically to push me into that canal. I had to get hope back on my own that day. But there have been many times in my life where I couldn't do that, where I couldn't get hope back on my own, where I truly had to rely on other people in my life to give me hope. I ended up being in the hospital for 6 months. I lost hope many times. And I had amazing people, these sweethearts in my life, pull me out of that and give me that hope that I truly, truly needed. Now, I lost a lot of things. I lost the use of my hands. That's it. That's all I can do. I can move my hands that much. Now, I drive a car with no adaptions in it. I cook the same way. I don't use any special equipment. Really, I just have figured out how to live my life the way that I have to, with the things that I have. Now, I understand that I lost those things, the use of my hands, my ears, my nose, my hair. I lost a lot of things. I didn't realize until later that I lost two very important things that we truly need to survive: significance and acceptance. I lost my significance and I lost my acceptance. Now I'm going to talk to you quite a bit about acceptance and that loss of acceptance and how I got it back. Then I'll touch a little bit on significance as well. Now, I told you I was in the hospital for 6 months. That's a long time. Lost hope a lot. Even after I got out of the hospital, when people thought, hey, Rick's doing better, I was not. Now, of course, they thought I was doing better. I was out of the hospital. They don't let you out of the hospital until you're doing better. But I wasn't. Physically, sure, I was doing better. Mentally, I was a mess. Because in the hospital, I was comfortable. I wanted to get out of that hospital every single day. But I was comfortable in the sense that when people came into my room, no one was surprised by what they saw because they saw me every single day. They weren't surprised. But now I had to leave that. And I had to go out in public. And I had to deal with people seeing me for the first time ever, seeing something they've never seen before. And when they saw me, they were very surprised. It was very obvious to me. Every single person was staring at me. Now, I can deal with people staring at me. That does not bother me at all. In the beginning, it bothered me a little bit, but I still understood why it was happening. Now, I'm telling you right now, I'm guilty of staring as well, because when we see something new, our brain is just trained to figure it out. Why is it like this? So I understand people look a little too long trying to figure out what they're seeing. So that's okay. That's not why I felt hopeless when I left the hospital. Hopelessness came from the fact that when I went out in public, children, they weren't only staring at me, they were very obviously terrified of me. Like I say obviously because I could see it. Every single time a kid saw me, they would hide behind their parents' legs or they would run away. Like, that was horrible for me. Now, 24% of the population is 8 years old and under. So that meant a quarter of the population was afraid of me. How do you get used to something like that? I had no clue how to get used to something like that. I had no idea how I was going to get through it. I had no idea that I couldn't do it on my own, but truly I couldn't do it on my own. I tried. I needed somebody in my life to help me through it, to give me that hope that I was talking about. Now, my brother, he was helping take care of me when I was out of the hospital. And one day, him and I went to a restaurant, and we were sitting at a table together. And at a table across from us, there happened to be a family sitting at this table. And there was a little girl in the family. And of course, she sat on the side of the table so that she was staring at me. Now, I could tell that she was also afraid of me, which, I was not used to. I mean, you don't get used to something like that, but I saw it every day. And, it bummed me out. It made me feel pretty hopeless. Now, she was sitting right next to her grandfather. Her grandfather saw that she was staring at me. This was in San Antonio, Texas. That's where the hospital was. That's where I did my recovery. Very military-oriented town, city. And so people saw somebody who was burned. They most likely recognized them as some type of service member. So the grandfather was probably in the service, or at least recognized me as being in the service. So he felt comfortable enough to look at his granddaughter and say to her, "Go say hi to him." Now, obviously, she did not want to come over and say hello to me. She was afraid. She was terrified. So she didn't move. And I'm telling you right now, I didn't want her to come over to me anyways, because I know how this goes. She's afraid. She doesn't want to come over to me. I don't want to put her in that situation. So I was okay that she didn't come over when he said that. But he said it again. "Go say hi to him." Now, this time, that little girl did start to come over to me. And I did not want her to come all the way over to my table. Like I said, I knew she was uncomfortable. I didn't want to make it worse for her. So when she only got about halfway over to me, as nicely as I could say to her, I said, "Hey, how you doing?" But as soon as I said that first word, she stopped dead in her tracks. I'm telling you, like she saw a monster. And she turned around and she ran back to her grandpa as fast as she could. And I was like, "You know what, Rick? You are just going to have to get used to it or deal with it or figure it out." I don't know how I was supposed to do those things, but I knew I had to do one of them, even though I had no clue how. Truly what I needed was somebody to help me through it, even though I didn't recognize that. I needed one of those sweethearts. I needed somebody to give me hope. That little girl, she ran away from me. She got back to her grandfather and she looked at him and she said, "Grandpa, he's really nice. He's really nice." That is not what I thought she was going to say. And I know that's not what you thought she was going to say either. I thought for sure that little girl was going to run away from me, get back to her grandpa and say, "Grandpa, he's really scary." That's not what happened. In a moment of hopelessness for me, that little girl who was only 5 or 6 years old, she came over to me. She dumped a bucket of hope on me. And when she did that, she changed my life forever. And what did she do? She gave me hope. And with that hope, she showed me acceptance. Holy cow. Changed my life forever. A 5, 6-year-old little girl. She had no clue. She had hope inside of her that she could give to me. She had no clue that I needed hope, but she was still able to give it to me. She was still able to give it to me. Now imagine what you all are capable of at your age and with your knowledge. Like I said, she didn't recognize that I needed hope, but you do recognize those people that are struggling, that might feel hopeless. Maybe you just didn't know what you could do for them. But I'm telling you today that you all have hope inside of you that you can give to other people. And when you choose to give that hope to other people, you can change their life forever. And sometimes hope looks like acceptance. By accepting somebody, you give that person some hope. That little girl did it for me. I know for a fact you can do it for others. Acceptance. I lost it and I got it back in a very big way. I told you I lost significance as well. I was a soldier. I was a leader. And now who am I? I'm a guy in the hospital who can't even stand, who has his mom and dad feeding him. Like, who am I? I lost who I was. I didn't know who I was. And that was tough. And over the past 13 years, I've had some amazing people in my life, some amazing sweethearts in my life give me opportunities that led to me sitting in front of you all today and speaking. Trust me, I did not get here on my own, because in high school, I hated public speaking. I don't hate anything now, but at that time, I absolutely hated it. I was terrified of it. And now I do it for fun. I do it because I enjoy it. And it was that significance that I lost was given back to me through other people. I have a significance now. I know who I am, and I'm growing that every single day. We all have opportunities in our life. We all sometimes don't feel like we're accepted. We all see other people who aren't accepted. Show them some acceptance. Give them some hope. Maybe you know somebody who's struggling to find who they are, what their significance is. You know how you find out what their significance is? You ask them. You talk to them. You see what they love to do. And guess what? You might want them to do something. You might think they love to do something else. Don't grow that significance. That's your significance. Grow theirs. Help them. Be that sweetheart in their life. And you could change their life forever and maybe even save their life. I'm telling you right now, I've had sweethearts in my life who have come in and saved my life as well. Sweethearts, they change lives. They save lives. They give hope. In a time where things are so uncertain, we've never seen anything like this before, we have to hold on to find out the possibilities that exist for our future. I appreciate you all spending time with me today. I'm going to hand it back over to Tom to close us out.
You know, students and parents and educators and people listening, you know, I used to look at Rick as an American hero for what he did for our country, but I'll be quite honest with you. I never look at Rick as an American hero for that anymore. I look at that man as an American hero because he's given more hope to more kids, more people than anyone else I've ever met. There's kids all over the country that look at that man and say, that's how I feel on the inside. How can anyone love me? Like they're on fire, socially, psychologically, emotionally. That's why Rick is one of my 16th century bullies, one of my sweethearts. He's taught me so many things. He's taught me about this thing called hope and the possibilities that exist, even for someone like Rick Yarosh, someone who has changed so dramatically because of the injury that he had. I reference back to this 1950 and these people in Enterprise, Alabama, and I say they had a Rick Yarosh back then. They didn't understand, but what I want you all to understand here today is the fact that no matter what you're going through with this pandemic, with the other issues that are going on in our country, if you keep that perspective, if you surround yourself with these 16th century bullies and you understand that your greatest setback might just be an opportunity for your greatest comeback. And I feel like all the people I surround myself with through this pandemic and through the other things that are going on, it will be a great comeback if we do what they did. We get together as a community. We share and play with ideas and listen to one another. We may just have the greatest comeback in American history. The other thing that Rick and I talk about, and we spend a lot of time on these 16th century bullies, these sweethearts that give hope to other people. And please don't underestimate. I know that every single one of you has hope inside of you that you could give to other people, but it's a choice that you make or you won't. It's the beginning of the solution to this entire issue, this notion of 16th century bullying, this common thread that we all share. But the other big thing that Rick and I talk about, and it's easy to talk when you go and speak with Rick and get on a stage with Rick, it's this notion of heroes. And you know, Rick Yarosh doesn't look at himself as an American hero for what he did for our country either. The fact is, Rick looks at himself as an American hero because of the hope he gives to other people. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the other half of what we talk about, because if we're truly going to change the world, we need more heroes. And I believe with all my heart that every single one of us has the power to become someone's hero. And that's one of the things that Rick and I do. We go into schools and communities and we teach young people how to do this idiom that you all know. When I get in an auditorium full of young kids and I say, what do superheroes do? They jump into, and they'll all finish that sentence because they still remember this thing called jumping into action. It was the great educator Herbert Spencer that said the great aim of education is never knowledge, it's action. And that's what superheroes do. It's a defining characteristic that makes someone a superhero is their willingness to jump into action and do things other people aren't willing to do. Action changes everything. I like to say to young people all the time, your thoughts determine what you want, but your actions determine what you get. And we talk a lot about jumping into action. And there's one thing that I've really doubled down on in this whole thing that's happening recently in this country is the fact that superheroes, they do make mistakes. Superheroes also live by a moral code, and they live by this code. And I ask young people to use caution because jumping into action can certainly also cause a lot of problems for people. When we do things to impinge on someone else's right or their property or their life, we certainly have to be careful when we jump into action. It's something we should double down on and have good discussions with young people about are the code that a superhero lives by. But when I talk to young people about jumping into action, as I bring this whole discussion home and leave you with a thought and something to take into your communities, please understand this, because this is one of the big things that Rick and I talk to young people about. We say there's 2 reasons that young people don't jump into action, and you should know these reasons. You should have conversations about these reasons. I take you right back to the beginning of this discussion when I say, what do you do when you catch on fire? You stop, drop, and roll. And, we have become known as this stop, drop, and roll of bullying. We've torn this whole formula apart when it comes to stop, drop, and roll. And you say, why does it work? And it's a specific formula. Stop, drop, and roll it's simple, it's action-based, and it's life-saving. It's simple, it's action-based, and life-saving. And hopefully we'll be able to visit some of your schools and bring this simple, action-based, life-saving plan that we certainly don't have time to get into right here. But I said there's 2 reasons that kids don't jump into action. And each of you as individuals should think about these things. And parents listening and educators listening, you should think about these things. There's 2 main reasons. Number 1, strategy. When I ask most young people, what do you do when you see someone not being treated the right way? The first thing they say is, tell an adult, tell a teacher. But the fact is they're not going to do that. That breaks the code, the pack code that you operate by. Our young people don't know what to do. And we bring a very simple, action-based plan that helps young people jump into action and help those people other people aren't willing to help, because that's what makes a superhero. I like to tell kids all the time, I say, life is not a talent contest, it's a strategy game. And that's what we do. We give young people strategies on how to jump into action appropriately and change the state that other kids are in, especially kids that feel hopeless. But the other thing that I leave you with, that I ask you to think deeply about, especially in this time right now, is the other reason that kids don't jump into action. It isn't just because they don't know what to do. It's because they feel silly or ridiculous. They feel silly or ridiculous. And that brings me to a very special word that we spend a lot of time talking to young people about, this thing called vulnerability. And when I say in giant auditoriums or groups of people, I say, what's the first word that comes to your mind when you hear or think of the word vulnerability? And everybody comes up with something associated with weakness, because that's what we've done in our culture. We associate vulnerability with weakness. And I like saying to people all the time, I say, you know, a little boy or a little girl, and moms and dads say, yeah. And I say, well, imagine your 7-year-old little daughter wanting to do the talent show, and you support her and you put her in front of the entire school, and she climbs that stage and the spotlight's on her. She's making herself vulnerable, right? And they say, yeah. And I say, you mean to tell me that she's being weak? Nothing could be further from the truth. We have to have young people understand that vulnerability equals strength. They have to understand that, but vulnerability takes practice. So when you put a strategy or a plan into place and you practice that plan like any other skill, and that's what we don't do. We practice all of these other skills in education, but we don't spend time practicing vulnerability and things like that that will make a difference when young people see people not being treated the right way. When they see young people that are hopeless, they'll know what to do and they'll have the practice and be able to do it. I'll leave you with one last thought here. You know, the great Albert Einstein had this figured out well before any of us ever did. And we should certainly pay heed to this, especially at this very time in American history. Einstein said, "This world is a dangerous place to live, not because of evil people, but because of those who choose to do nothing about it." We certainly don't have a bullying problem in North America. We certainly, I would even say, don't have other problems that are spread across the headlines today. I would say that we have a sweetheart and hero problem. People that are unwilling to give hope to people that are hopeless, and people that are unwilling to take action, to do things other people aren't willing to do, and to live by a code to treat people the right way. I give you much thanks for allowing us to be here today, and I hope that we certainly can connect with you and your school and your community, because I know if we build a country of sweethearts and heroes, people that give hope and people that take action, we will change the world. Thank you, PFEW. Thank you, Rick Yarosh, for joining me. Please, you all have the power to become someone's hero. Thanks so much, and hopefully I'll see you all in a couple weeks. And I guess we're going to come on right after this and perhaps do some question and answers on another site, and we look forward to connecting with all of you. Over to you, PFEW.
Thank you, Tom and Rick. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up this evening, we do have a few questions that I think would be important for everyone to hear. So we do have from one of our viewers here a question, very important. What should I do if I give up on everything? Like hope, like forgiveness, like trust.
How much time do we have? Rick, you want to take a stab at this? I mean, you're a guy that has thought many times, I'm sure, as you know, you and I have had conversations. You and I have had many conversations about those early years, and certainly wasn't just the acceptance that you struggled with and the meaning or the purpose in your life, but you know, you've taken me through some very, very dark conversations personally, you and I, about those times that you struggled deeply with giving up. And certainly another deep aspect that you have some perspective on that I hope I never have perspective on are the friends that you've lost that have actually given up, and the way I know that it's impacted you in your heart and the families that have just given up.
Sure. So, you know, I mentioned the one time in Iraq when I lost hope. That wasn't it. There's been many times where I have struggled majorly to get through. I can remember one time seeing my face for the first time when I was in the hospital. I wanted to die. Like, because my mind was like, you know, if I ever get out of here, when I ever get out of here, who's going to give a crap about a guy that looks like that? Who's going to want to hug that guy? Who's going to want to wake up next to that guy? No one in my mind. So that's just another example. That's just two examples. I have too many to explain to you where I have struggled. But I'm telling you right now, every single time when I struggle, the answer for me is to turn to somebody and talk to somebody. Because like our reaction, and it's a natural reaction, and I fight this too when I deal with something difficult, is to like lock ourselves away and to make time for ourselves and think about it. Like you can do that for a minute or two, but then you need to break out of that and you need to talk to somebody. And maybe that somebody is somebody who's trained, who listens. That's what they do. They're good at listening. You know, Tom talks about this a lot. Like I had therapists when I got out of the hospital. And when somebody has to talk to a therapist, they always think that there's something wrong, there's something broken. Like And that's just not true. You're just a human being who's dealing with some crazy things. And most of the times when you have to go talk to somebody about it, it's because you're dealing with it for the first time. Like, that's why, because you don't have a clue how to get through it. So they send you to a therapist. Tom always says, you know what? Don't call him a therapist. Call him your coach. I mean, when you learn something for the first time, a lot of times it's a coach who teaches you. So that's all they're doing, is they're just teaching you how to deal with things. Now, when I would sit and I would talk to this coach, this therapist, sometimes I was like, man, they have no idea what I'm dealing with. They have no clue what I'm dealing with, because they've never been in a war. They've never been on fire. They've never dealt with the things that I've dealt with. And sometimes I'm like, you know what? I'm not getting anything from this. And I think, now this is 13 years later, 12 years later, when I'm thinking about this, I think I got so much out of it just by talking about it. That's it. It didn't matter what this person said back to me, because they didn't say a whole lot back to me. They listened. And a lot of the times, I think I'm doing as well as I'm doing today because I talk. I talk about it. I talk about it as an important part of my life. And some of it is bad, but it's most of it, I would almost say all of it, has turned into something really, truly amazing. So I would say, when you're dealing with some hopelessness in your life, the first thing you got to do is you got to talk to somebody about it. And maybe it's a close friend. And maybe that close friend will point you in the right direction. And maybe that close friend is just going to sit there and listen. That's great. But maybe you feel like you didn't get enough out of it. You need to talk to somebody else. You just need to keep talking about it to people. And eventually you're going to get the solution. And sometimes the solution is just time. Sometimes that's all it is. It's just time. You're just buying time by talking to these people until you break through that hopelessness, until something amazing comes your way. I didn't ask for that little girl to come to me. It just happened. And eventually things like that in your life will happen as well. That's just a promise, but you have to hold on to find out. And sometimes it's hard to see into the future. Sometimes it's impossible to see into the future, but you have to hold on to find out those amazing moments that will happen in your life as well. So that's my take on it. When you're feeling hopeless, talk to somebody.
Yeah, I don't want to just repeat what Rick said, but there's a lot of real value in what Rick said. I made some notes. Every time Rick speaks, I write something down, because he says something, and I've been listening to Rick for 8 or 9 years now. We've been together. He is right. There's not a physicist alive that won't tell you that time, space, and matter at some point 15 billion years ago came into existence. And time is an amazing creation, however it was created. And it does some amazing things. And, Rick says that I typically use that when a young person says to me, I go to a therapist. I'm certainly not taking away from the training that therapists have, but when I talk to young people, I give them this magic violin. And I hate when I find someone that actually knows how to play the violin, but most kids, I say, I got a violin, can you play it? And they say, no. And I say, okay, well, I'm handing you a pretty tricky violin. It's got some broken strings and a twisted head on it. You need a coach to learn how to play it regardless. But whatever's going on in your life, you got a pretty difficult, busted up violin, and you need a coach that's going to be able to teach you how to play this violin that may never go back to a beautiful, brand new violin. And I've seen Rick also. So I think getting a coach is the most important thing. And we know the statistics show us that kids that talk about issues, a lot of times we spend a lot of time on suicide and talking to kids, attempting that kind of destructive decision. And a lot of times even parents, if you're listening, or adults, they'll say, we shouldn't talk about that. But the research shows exactly the opposite. Talking about these kind of things actually do help. And I know it's hard to get started. I like saying to kids all the time, it's the start that stops most people. It's the start that stops most people. It's hard to start that conversation, but you got to have it. And one of the easiest ways to start that conversation is to find something you like. If you like horses, if you like cars, go find or volunteer some time in a stable, or volunteer some time in a garage, and then start your conversations there. And pick the brains of people that have also maybe had twisted and beat up violins, and that's a good way to learn and get some perspective. But I think Rick's right. I know he is. Just having that conversation will help kids. So there's nothing easy about it. You know, I mean, if you look at some of the greats like Viktor Frankl and some of the people that went through the unimaginable, and I put Rick Yarosh in that category, they always find that suffering led to the greatest meaning in their lives. So sometimes you got to lean into that suffering and that meaninglessness and say, maybe this could be one of the best things that's ever happened to me. And you'll have that great comeback.
Okay, Tom, Rick, we have another question. What should I say to someone that feels depressed?
Well, depression is a funny thing. You know, those of us, they say, that have never really understood it, you never will. It's a negative spiral from the research and the schooling that I've had. Spent time as an undergraduate in psychology, and you know, if you've never experienced depression, there's a pretty good chance you shouldn't be given a lot of advice. And I say this not to discredit young people that have amazing advice in a lot of areas, but one of the things I find young people do all the time is they like to talk to their friends because they're supposed to, because biologically and you know, that's what kids do. That's why your friends are so important to you. But having a conversation with someone that doesn't know or has never even had the opportunity to put their hands on that messed up violin, and I hate to just keep going back to that analogy, but I say that to young people all the time. They go and get advice from their friends, but you wouldn't get advice from your friend that's broke on how to make money. Why are you going to get advice from your friend that's never experience depression? So depression's a really tricky thing. Like I say all the time, I know that there's no direct correlation between bullying and suicide or many destructive decisions. It certainly could be something that pushes a kid over the edge. And that isn't to have an argument. Some kids would say, no, it does cause those things. But the research does not show a direct correlation between the two. But certainly there is a direct correlation between depression and some massive destructive decisions. And it's something that, especially as a young person, I would not feel good about giving advice on. The best thing you can do is go get help for your friend, because most people won't. And it's okay if your friend is mad at you. And I hate to say it like that, but the alternative and then making a decision that can't be taken back. I've talked to way too many parents and friends that have lost friends that said, I wish I had a conversation or went and talked to someone, because maybe I could have stopped something.
Okay, we have another question here. What should I do if my parents don't support me? I am trans and have been hiding it inside.
I'd love to get connected with that student if there's an opportunity. I mean, I can certainly make some. Rick, you want to make some comments? I don't want to steal the show.
Obviously it's difficult. I would say you do have a large support network in other places. There are so many people who are understanding and that could help you through it. And, you know, I don't want to put this on your parents or anything like that, but you have to understand that they're dealing with something new as well. So maybe it's just a little bit of time on their part, but I think in the meantime, and you know what, people grow and they can figure that out. But in the meantime, I think there are plenty of other avenues that you can find for support. I mean, and that's just not something I know a lot about. So, but those are the two things that I do know are available. Time, because I think, you know, they're just going to come to it. They're going to come to terms with it eventually. And also, there are plenty of people out there who will that you can talk to about it, because there's so much support out there.
Yeah, certainly getting help, as Rick said, is the key. But let me give just a little nugget of perspective to any student dealing with any issue. And Rick was just kind of hinting to this, and he's heard me talk to thousands and thousands of young people about this. And, you know, we do a lot of work with parents and parenting, and to answer this in a 2-minute discussion is a really difficult thing to do. But the one piece of a perspective that I give young people, especially if you're an only child or you're the oldest, but it doesn't matter, even if your siblings are a couple of years apart, I always give kids some really neat perspective, and I say, let me give you a secret. Because I have 4 kids. My oldest is 22 and my youngest is 16. And the one piece of advice I always give kids, especially even in front of your parents, I say, I'm going to tell you a secret right now. You ready? Your parents have no idea what they're doing. Like, they have no idea. You are a science experiment. They had you, and they're experimenting on you, and they're just doing what was done to them. And that makes people chuckle sometimes, and it lets a little bit of tension off. But when I go into it deeply with parents and educators, I say, listen, any principal, any teacher has spent 20 years preparing to become a principal or a teacher. 20 years, right? Like between middle school, high school, undergraduate, graduate, you got 20 years into your education before you got your job. And if I ask any adult alive, what are the 5 most important things in your life? You're going to say, my kids, my significant other, my faith, or my belief system. I just nailed all top 3 for every single person on this call. I don't care what order you put them in, but there's your top 3. Your kids, your significant other, your belief system, or your faith. When you get to number 4, you're going to tell me your hobby. Like, I know what my hobbies are and what my passion is and what I like to do in my free time. And if most of you out there are listening could quit your job and just go boating or just go mountain climbing or whatever your thing is, you would. And then all of you are going to get to number 5, which is your job or your career. It gives you meaning. It gives you purpose, right? Now, you just told me you spent 20 years preparing for number 5 on your list before you got it. And I always look parents right in the face after I have that conversation. And I say, how many years you spend preparing for number 1 on your list? Silence. I just wait. And there's this uncomfortable feeling. They haven't. And I say, oh, you want me to answer that for you? Like, how long have you spent preparing for number 1? What was it, about 9 months before you got it? Your kid? So my point is, whoever asked that question and whatever you're dealing with out there, just don't forget. And certainly your parents aren't going to make the right decisions. They're going to make a lot of mistakes, because you know how I know that? Because I had 4 kids and I made a lot of mistakes. And if you ask my kids, they'll tell you just how many I made. And if they're open to listening, and love does shine through all of that, and time is an amazing thing, like Rick said, like I mentioned before, but you got to find a way to get it out there safely. I've talked to a lot of kids who brought things up. I was in a Catholic school once where it's like real taboo, you know, to be gay. And this young lady came up to me and has hidden it for years. She not only had to deal with the shame in her own personal life about her parents, but also her faith, and being in this all-girls school where she just wasn't like everyone. And it was great because about 2 years later, I saw her, and it was really difficult, the conversation she had with her parents. But get a support network. Don't give up, though. It's really easy to just throw your hands up when mom or dad screams at you and what you feel like they want to disown you, because all you really want to do is make them proud. I get it, because I wanted to make my parents proud, and my kids want to make me proud, and that's a tough thing to wrestle with. But just be gentle with your parents. I know that sounds kind of goofy, but they really have no idea what they're doing. So be gentle with them. They never read a book or a manual, and they're just trying to figure it out like you are. Don't forget that piece of perspective.
All right. Thank you again, Tom and Rick, for your time here this evening and an amazing inaugural event. If we didn't get to your individual questions, please join our live virtual meet and greet session with both Tom and Rick that'll begin here right after this event. And a link has now been provided in the comments section. Simply exit out of this meeting and join using the new meeting link.
All right.
Finally,
thank you, everybody. We'll see you.
Yes, and finally, this session was recorded and will be made available to everyone in a few days on our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And thank you to all of our donors who have allowed us to offer some wonderful summer programming, including this live speaker series, our pre-taped interviews that will be coming soon, and also our free offering of the stock market game. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to gathering next Thursday at 8 p.m. when we will hear from Mr. Jeff Yalden. Have a great night, a safe week, and we'll see you next Thursday.